Have you ever paid attention to the warning labels on things before? There are things you would never expect to need a warning label, but they have one. For example, there's a warning label on a chainsaw that says, "Do not hold the wrong end of the chainsaw." That's free advice, people. There are sun shields that people put in the front windshield of their cars when they park, and the purpose is to keep the car from getting too hot while they're out of it. And the warning label on them says, "Do not drive with the sun shield in place." Wow. Wow. There's a label on a washing machine that says, "Warning, do not put any person in this washer." That includes younger siblings, and I think that we should assume it means the family pet as well. I don't know why whatever. There's a label on a carton of eggs that says, "Warning, may contain eggs." There's a sticker on a wheelbarrow that says, "Not intended for highway use." What? There's one on a baby stroller that says, "Remove child before folding." It's all funny until you start to think, whoa, time out. Have people actually done these things before? Warnings show up just about anywhere, not just on sun shields and washing machines, but even at church. In fact, maybe it feels like we're warned about more things at church than anywhere else. We've heard warnings against all kinds of activities and choices, and for the most part, they boil down to one word: sin. Just hearing the word brings a negative vibe with it, doesn't it? Whether you've been coming to church for as long as you can remember, or if this is your first time here, welcome. The idea of sin is probably familiar. We understand that sin is something bad that we should avoid. But isn't it also true that when it comes to sin, we tend to think of it as a sliding scale? Here's what I mean. When we think of sin, we think that it's bad, but surely some sins are worse than others. Of course, we shouldn't be disrespectful to our mom, but that's way better than murder. We probably don't need to tell a lie, but at least we're not stealing from people. We know that we shouldn't cheat on a quiz, but that's not as big of a deal as beating someone up. And eventually that leads to this question: does all sin matter the same? Is it possible that we're overreacting about the sin that doesn't seem like as big of a deal? How much damage do these smaller sins really do, especially if they aren't hurting anyone? When it comes to copying someone else's homework, breaking curfew, or telling a small lie, it seems harmless. So it definitely shouldn't be taken as seriously, right? To answer these questions, we're gonna go back to the book of Galatians, where we've spent the past couple weeks. Just to recap, the book of Galatians isn't really a book at all. It's a letter that the Apostle Paul, the most famous missionary who ever lived, wrote to a church of new followers of Jesus. To best understand what Paul is saying and why, it's important to know that Christianity was a new thing. People were just hearing about this Jesus guy for the first time. And when they heard the story of his life, his death, and coming back to life, people were hooked. Jesus came to show people a picture of God. After all, he was God. He talked about God's kingdom coming to earth, but not with force or violence, but with love, mercy, and compassion. People were seeing God in a way they hadn't before, and it really caught their attention. This was something they wanted to be a part of. But of course, this all came with questions. Everybody was trying to figure out just what following Jesus should look like in their own world. Particularly, they wanted to know what they had to do and what they did not need to do. Basically, they wanted to know about the sin sliding scale. When it came to sin, what was a big deal and what wasn't? Paul answers the question by writing this: "You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit." So let's not get tired of doing what is good. At just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. You may wonder what this had to do with the question. Well, at the time, people lived in an agricultural culture. Say that 5 times fast. The economy revolved around what was planted, grown, and then sold. So, to this audience, it made sense. When it comes to farming, you reap what you sow. What you plant is what you grow. If you plant corn, you're eventually gonna grow a corn stalk. What you plant now determines what you harvest later. So when Paul compared choices and outcomes to planting and harvesting, his audience understood exactly what he was saying. Paul was telling him that your choices now will determine what you eventually harvest. What's true for crops is true for your life. To put it another way, your decisions will someday bear fruit or have consequences. It may not happen tomorrow, but every choice and action is planting seeds for your future. Paul is asking, if you will one day harvest what you've planted, what do you want your harvest to look like? And instead of giving the Galatians a simple list of what sins to avoid and what sins can be taken a little less seriously, Paul tells the Galatians this: those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. I know that's really strong language, but Paul feels strongly about what he's telling these people. And Paul loved these people very much. He's telling them that bad choices lead to bad outcomes. It's just how life works. So, while it may seem like Paul is answering a question that we aren't asking, the truth is, he's getting right to the heart of the matter. If we're wondering what sins matter more than others, he's telling us that's the wrong question. Instead of asking, what can we get away with? Paul says we should be asking, what do we want to harvest? Because every decision has a harvest. It never just stands alone with no consequences. There's always an effect. So maybe you don't consider gossip that big of a deal, but if you continually plant gossip, then you will eventually get the results of gossip. You may ruin a friendship this year, or maybe the harvest will happen sometime in the future. Maybe someone will carry the hurtful words you said about them for years afterwards. Or if you continually choose to not study and cheat to pass certain classes in high school, you may not have the foundation you need for advanced courses in college. Or if you continue to tell lies, you may not be trusted in the future. If you continue to use drugs, alcohol, or sex to cope, you may harvest addiction, longer-term effects on your body, or just an inability to deal with the stuff life throws at you. When we change the question from what can I get away with to what do we want to harvest, it changes everything. If that sounds depressing, hang on, because the good news is that what Paul says also works the other way. If you're planting good decisions, you're gonna experience a harvest of life. If you're planting the stuff that gives life, the stuff Jesus talks about, like joy, peace, rest, compassion, you'll grow those things. They'll take root in your life. Jesus said it this way: my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. Some translators use the word abundant or full here instead of rich. Imagine an abundant or full harvest of things like peace, joy, satisfaction. I'd love for us to start asking the questions, what seeds do I want to plant? And what kind of things do I want to grow? Let's let that be the filter we use to make decisions. For some of us, we've spent a big part of our lives asking the wrong questions. I get it. It's a lot easier to just know if we can do something or not, or how bad something is, really. But asking the wrong questions can lead us to harvesting the wrong things. And we don't want to end up somewhere years down the road wondering how we got where we are. If we use our freedom to ask, is this helpful? Is this kind? Is this the way to an abundant life that Jesus talked about? We are more likely to end up where we want to be, growing what we want to grow, because this is true of all of us. How you use your freedom now determines how much freedom you have later. Do you want your parents to give you more freedom later? Then plant trust, respect, and honor now. Do you want healthy friendships later? Then plant kindness, honesty, and compassion now. Do you want freedom with money later? Plant patience, self-control, and wisdom now. Here's a way to picture what I'm talking about.
Think about it this way. Paul talked about harvesting what you plant, which is an agricultural example. In high school, you can choose to make decisions that build the trust you have with people, like your parents or teachers. Every time you make those decisions, it's like planting a little bit of trust, like this. Or you can choose to use your treasure or money in ways now that plant seeds of generosity or financial responsibility, like this. Or you can use your talents in ways now that plant seeds of hard work and humility, whether that's sports or music or anything else. Or you can use your time now in ways that plant seeds of good habits and responsibility, like this. The way you use the freedom you have now when it comes to things like trust, treasure, talent, and time, plant seeds for what these areas of your life look like in the future, whether that's in a year, 5 years, or 50 years. The way you plant seeds now will determine the amount of things like trust with adults. Financial freedom. Work ethic. And responsibility. You can have in the future. This is the way freedom works. How you use it now determines how much of it you have later.
Following Jesus is about freedom and about life. And Jesus wants you to harvest a great and abundant life. But you don't start a harvest with harvesting. You start a harvest by planting. And you need to know when it comes to planting and harvesting, we aren't saying that the harvesting effects of sin or consequences of sin is God punishing you or being out to get you. It's really about us harvesting the natural consequences to sin. God isn't out to get us. God is trying to protect us from the consequences of sin. That's why God wants you to use the freedom you have to plant the kinds of things that create the life God wants for you. Sin always comes with a warning label. And those labels aren't God's way of threatening you or scaring you or making you feel guilty. God gives us warning labels so we can experience the kind of freedom that comes from planting and harvesting the things that are truly best. And that kind of planting and harvesting leads to the kind of freedom and the kind of future we really want. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out just what we want to harvest long term. That's why our small groups are so important. It's a chance to talk through these big questions with people going after the same things and with a leader who can help you. So when you head to group, be thinking through how you can encourage each other to plant seeds today that lead to more freedom in the future.